To you.
Hi everyone. Happy New Year. Thanks for the introduction, Sam. So my name is Hannah Julienne, and I lead the Behavioural Economics Unit at the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. And today I'm going to talk to you about some research we've been doing over the last year, a survey we've been running called the Behavioural Energy and Travel Tracker, or BETT for short. But first of all, for those of you who don't know, SEAI is Ireland's National Sustainable Energy Authority, so Ireland's energy agency, essentially. And what we do is we work with householders, businesses, communities, and government to create a cleaner energy future. And if you ask the average person in Ireland who SEAI are, assuming they've heard of us, what they'll probably tell you is that we're the people who give the grants. So a lot of SEI is focused around delivering programs such as grants for home retrofit, electric vehicles, that sort of thing. But we also have a kind of research and policy insight function, which is where the behavioral economics unit sits. And we help with the design of these programs. We help with the evaluation, and we also generate evidence for policy and give advice to other organizations and departments, such as our parent government department, the Department for Environment, Climate and Communications. And it's kind of in this advice function that the research I'm going to present today sits. So what I'm going to do in the next half hour or so is, first of all, spend a bit of time talking through the methodology of the BETT survey and why we're running it. I'm going to pick out some of the most important findings we have to date that might be relevant in an international context. If I have time, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about future directions for BETT and what we're planning to do next, and then a quick summary at the end. So first of all, just to kind of introduce BETT, what it is, how it works. So back in 2022, Ireland, like a lot of countries around Europe, was facing an energy crisis, and the Irish government, took a number of different measures to address this. One of which was launching an awareness campaign called Reduce Your Use. So this was a kind of widespread advertising campaign, and around this time we were doing various bits of research to support our parent department in this Reduce Your Use campaign, one of which, and the most kind of important of which, is the Behavioural Energy and Travel Tracker. So BETT is a monthly online survey. It ran, or at least the data I'm going to show you today, was from December 2022 to 2023, and it's run with a nationally representative sample of 1,000 adults each month. Looking into 2024, we're still finalizing what we're going to do, but we're looking at running it perhaps on a quarterly basis. And the idea behind BETT really is just that in order to kind of create a campaign and create communications that are really going to be relevant to people, going to be effective, focusing on behaviors that are going to be impactful, we need to first know what people are doing in the first place. So we need to know where people are perhaps being inefficient in their energy use, so we can target the communications accordingly. And so that's really the kind of main function of BETT, is informing communications, but both specifically in Reduce Your Use, but also, I guess, more generally. It also has a kind of smaller secondary function, which is to actually evaluate the impact of the campaign, not in any sort of strict sense, but just, by the very nature of tracking behavior over time, we can see if things are moving in the right direction and see if that's related to ad recall. But that's more of a, secondary function, and it's this informing communication side that I'm going to be talking about today. But yeah, so BETT is a survey, but it's not necessarily the kind of normal type of survey you think about. It uses specific techniques from behavioral science to hopefully improve its accuracy. So we use something called the day reconstruction method. So to get the idea of this, so if you think of a normal survey, that you might people might respond to about their energy use, the questions tend to be relatively general in that, you might ask someone, are you making an effort to reduce your energy use? Are you washing your clothes at a lower temperature? Are you, turning off the light switches after use? And this is fine, but I guess one of the issues you encounter with this type of survey is, of course, kind of recall bias and social desirability bias, where even not that people necessarily want to lie as such, but if you're thinking back on your behavior, you're probably more inclined to remember the times where you were making an effort to do something rather than the times you weren't. So your responses might be slightly biased, even if you don't mean them to be. And there's also perhaps an issue with kind of the temporal granularity of responses. So if you're thinking back on your recent behavior, you know, how far back are you really thinking? You know, it's hard to kind of get a very precise snapshot of people's behavior at a particular point in time. So the day reconstruction method gets around some of this. You know, it's not perfect. We can't completely eliminate bias, but the way it does this is by, instead of asking people what they're doing generally in their lives, it gets them to focus on one specific day. So typically the previous day. So instead of asking, you know, what are you doing at the moment in general, say, what did you do yesterday specifically, even if it wasn't a typical day for you? And by kind of making it much more factual, we can get around some of this social desirability and recall bias. And this is an approach I personally, and Kieran actually on the team as well, took before in a previous role where we were running a survey during COVID to track people's social activity throughout the pandemic. And we found this day reconstruction method was very useful for getting an accurate picture of people's behavior, and was very useful for informing communications during COVID. So the idea was to do something similar during the energy crisis. So so I'm going to spend a bit of time now bringing you through the survey. Obviously, I'm not going to go through everything in detail because there's a huge amount in it, but I'm going to kind of show you how this day reconstruction method works. So first of all, when people start answering the survey, we ask them to think about the previous day and write down what they did. So for example, if somebody was doing the survey today, which is Wednesday, we'd ask them what they did on Tuesday, even if it wasn't a typical day for them, because the idea is, even if it's not a typical day for a given individual, on average across the whole population, we'll get you know, a typical view of what's going on at that point in time. So we asked them to actually write down what they did in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening, thinking specifically about how they used energy. But we don't use that for analysis. That's just to jog their memory as to what they actually did. Then the meat of the survey, what takes up the most time, is we've asked them very detailed follow-up questions about their behavior on the previous day. So BETT captures data both on people's kind of travel behavior and also their home energy behaviors. So first of all, we ask them about any journeys they made. So we'll ask them, for example, how many journeys they made the previous day. So you can see people are making typically between 2 and 3 journeys a day. And then for each one of those journeys in turn, we'll ask some detailed follow-up questions again. So for example, one of the questions we ask is what mode of transport they used. And you can see from this graph here that we've got very high car dependency in Ireland, about 70% of journeys being made by car. We also ask them about their home heating and hot water use. So for example, we ask them, first of all, what types of heating they used on the previous day. You can see that plotted across the year here. Of course, this is a lot more seasonal. You've got about 3/4 of people using their central heating in the winter months, and that drops right down in the summer, as you'd expect. And then again, for each type of heating that they said they use, we'll ask them some follow-up questions. So for example, we asked them how long they had the heating on for. So this graph shows how long they had the central heating on for in the reference day across the months. So we've got travel, heating, and then the kind of last major group of behaviors we look at is appliance use. We ask about cooking separately, and then we ask about different electrical appliances. So this is just kind of a snapshot here of some of the appliances we ask about, and you can see what proportion of people use them in a given day across the months. You can see TV and kettle comes up on top there. Some are less common. A lot of them are fairly stable across the year. Some of them are more seasonal, especially dehumidifier and the electric blanket. And again, you're kind of going to see the pattern now, but for each one of these that they said that they use, we'll ask them detailed follow-up questions about one random instance of their use. So for example, for anyone who said that they used the washing machine the previous day, we'll ask them very specific questions about what kind of cycle they use, including what temperature. So you can see this is the temperature settings people used on their washing machine, which are fairly stable over time. So all of what I've shown you so far is basically what constitutes the day reconstruction method, that kind of initial exercise of thinking back over the day and then answering the detailed kind of very factual follow-up questions. And then the last section of the survey, then we ask a range of questions related to other factors that we think might be related to behavior. So psychological factors, whether they saw the Reduce Your Use campaign, energy poverty metrics, and sociodemographics. So, for example, one of the psychological measures that we track is worry about cost of living, climate change, and energy security. You can see from this here that cost of living, worry about cost of living comes out on top and has been very steady over the study period. Worry about climate change comes in a bit lower than that, but is also very steady. Worry about energy security has kind of declined a fair bit over time. This is just another example of one of the other questions we ask is we ask people to report the monthly energy costs. Obviously, there's a fair amount of uncertainty around this, but this allows us then to start looking at, energy poverty metrics based on income and proportion of income spent on energy, for example. And you can see here that there, different types of expenditure have different levels of seasonality. So that's a very kind of quick overview of what's in the survey. Obviously, there's a lot more in it than I've shown you there, but that's the kind of rough outline. And as you can imagine, this generates a huge amount of data that we could look at in lots of different ways. But our analysis approach so far has been roughly this. So on the one hand, we've been particularly interested in defining and tracking what we call inefficient behaviors or energy wasting behaviors. So the choice of these is somewhat arbitrary, but the idea is basically that we want to look for instances where people are using energy where they might not need to, where there's potential for energy savings. So we track, for example, under travel, we look at whether people took short journeys using a car. Under heating and hot water, we look at heating on occupied space, high thermostat settings, having heating on in summer, or having long or multiple showers. And then we also look at inefficient appliance use, both kind of cooking appliances and some of those larger domestic appliances, and whether they use the tumble dryer at all. So once we have some of these inefficient behaviors defined, then the kind of next step of our analysis is running regression models to investigate the relationship between these behaviors and some of the other factors that we track. So namely, sociodemographic factors and psychological factors as well. So this is kind of, roughly speaking, the approach we've been taking to our analysis so far. So I'm going to move on now to some of our main findings. So as you can imagine, we've got lots and lots of findings. Some of them might be very interesting in an Irish context, looking at the prevalence of a specific behavior. But I'm conscious that, this is an international audience. So what I've tried to do is pull out what I think are maybe 6 of our most important findings, at a high level that might be relevant across different contexts. And yeah, needless to say, I'm using the data from all of last year. So it's December 2022 to December 2023. So the first finding is quite a general one, but I think important, which is that these inefficient behaviors that we track, they're really quite highly prevalent and prevalent year round. So you'll remember on the last slide I showed you, there's I think maybe about 10 different inefficient behaviors that we track. I'm not going to show them all here because that would take up the rest of my time. But just to pull out a few examples, if you look at the green line on top first, so this is people using their washing machine inefficiently. And with all of these, and a lot of the results I'm going to show you, it's important to remember that this isn't, the number of people who do this. Sometimes this is the number of people or the proportion of people who are doing it in one given day. So in any given day, you've got about 2 in 5 people who are using their washing machine inefficiently, where inefficiently is defined as, using high temperatures, not using eco settings, or putting the wash on when it's not full. Slightly lower, but still highly prevalent in the winter is heating unoccupied rooms, which given, the energy intensity of heating is one of our most important or most wasteful behaviors. So about 1/3 of people heating unoccupied rooms in the winter. Obviously, this drops down in the summer. But what's interesting is that, where our heating behaviors and our inefficient heating behaviors are highly seasonal, as you'd expect, most of our other behaviors really aren't seasonal at all, even where we did expect to see some seasonality. So if you look down at the 3rd line and the purple line, this is the proportion of people traveling by car for a short journey, a very short journey, under 2 kilometers in a given day. So it's lower, but it's still 15% of people doing this in any given day. And that's extremely steady across the year. So we might have expected that in the summer, when the weather is a bit better, fewer people would be using a car for short journeys, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The second main finding then that I want to show you, which I think is possibly the most important one, which is that different types of people are engaging in different inefficient behaviors. So again, there's lots of different behaviors I could show you. I've picked out 3 examples here. Again, the traveling by car for a short journey under 2 kilometers. Then I've got heating the home in the summer. And then the third one is using a tumble dryer. And I'll just briefly explain what these graphs are showing. So what I've done here is I've plotted the coefficients from regression models, to look at so it's showing the relationship between these different sociodemographic factors and the likelihood of engaging in that behavior. The colored bars are where there is a statistically significant effect. And then the green bars are where people in that group are less likely to perform the behavior, and the red bars, they're more likely. But the point of this slide isn't, it's not to go into each specific behavior and look who's performing it, who's not performing it. What I really want to highlight is that it's different for the different behaviors. So if you take, for example, gender, so down on the bottom here, we see men, for example, are less likely to, use a car for short journeys, but they're more likely to use the tumble dryer, and they're no more or less likely to heat their home in the summer. As another example, if we look at high-income people compared to low-income people, they're much more likely to use a car for a short journey, also slightly more likely to use a tumble dryer, but they're less likely to heat their home in the summer. So, and this kind of pattern is, repeated across lots of different sociodemographic factors, lots of different behaviors. We don't see a clear pattern that people in this group, engage in more or less behaviors. Generally speaking, it varies a lot between different behaviors. And I think that matters because often, I've definitely seen instances of surveys being run before to try and get at people's energy behavior, and they pick maybe 3 or 4 behaviors and look at who's more or less likely to perform them. And then conclusions are drawn on that. It'll be like, oh yes, women save more energy in the home because they, do X, Y, and Z. Whereas if you looked at 3 other behaviors, you might have come to a different conclusion. So I think this is quite an important finding. That said, if we look at kind of sociodemographic factors as a whole, and look at it in general, look at all the behaviors, we do see some patterns. And what's important is we generally find that sociodemographic factors are more influential than psychological factors. So what I'm showing in this graph here is now I'm not focusing on any one given behavior. What we've done is taken a sum of all our inefficient behaviors that we track, or at least the ones that are relevant to the home. And we run a regression model on that total instead. And then also, so on the previous slide, I just showed you the sociodemographic factors. Now we've included some psychological factors on the top. And in a sense, this graph isn't the best way of showing the point I've made above because of what I just said. Sociodemographic factors, their effects differ depending on the behavior. So they're kind of almost cancelling each other out if you sum them up. But even given that they're cancelling each other out, you can see on the whole, those bars are bigger than for the psychological factors, whose effects are more consistent on behavior. And especially if you look at those red bars kind of up the top of the sociodemographics, they're basically about household composition. And you can see just living with other people seems to have a really strong effect on how many inefficient behaviors people are engaging in. So that's finding number 3. And then my last 3 findings, then I'm going to kind of focus on those psychological factors, because although the sociodemographic factors do seem to be more important, which to me points to, the importance of lifestyle and kind of the structures that surround us, psychological factors do also have an effect. So we'll focus on those for the next 3 findings. So first of all, first one I want to highlight is that, self-reported understanding of how to save energy is the most influential psychological factor that we track. So we just ask people, how well do you feel you understand how you can save energy at home? And, those that respond more highly on this scale engage in fewer inefficient behaviours. And this is something we've been kind of looking at in a bit more detail in later waves. So we've had the survey running over a year, but we do add questions in, take them out to try and probe into some issues. So we've been having a bit more of a look at objective understanding and comprehension, and we find that participants tend to underestimate the relative impact of the most intensive energy behaviors. So heating, for example, people underestimate how energy intensive heating is compared to, say, using the washing machine. And we also find some evidence for misconceptions. For example, I can't actually remember the exact statistic, but I think it might be about 20% of people that think that setting their thermostat higher will heat the room up quicker. The next finding then I'm going to highlight is that worry about climate change has a stronger relationship with efficiency than worry about cost of living. And in fact, people who are more worried about cost of living actually seem to be engaging in more inefficient behaviors. But when we ask people directly about what motivates them to save energy, they tell us that it's to save money. So we ask people to rank their motivations for saving energy at home, and saving money was the #1 motivation for, I think, about 80% of people. So there's kind of a mismatch there between people's stated motivations and what we see in the data ourselves. And that's something we encounter a lot in our work, that when we ask people directly, what can motivate people to save energy, or, what's important to people, the saving money comes out. But when we actually do some research and look at what's driving behavior, we see that worry about climate actually has a greater effect. And then the last kind of main finding then I'm going to highlight is that the effort that others are making, or the perceived effort that others are making, matters for people's own behavior. So people who thought that other people in Ireland, or the average Irish person, is doing more to save energy, these people were engaged in fewer inefficient behaviors themselves. And what's really interesting is that people systematically underestimate this effort that other people are making. So if you look at this graph here, this is plotting how much effort people think they themselves, other people in their household, or the average Irish person is making to reduce their home energy use. They respond on a 1 to 7 scale, where 1 is not making an effort, 7 is doing everything possible. And you can see people rate themselves fairly highly, between 5 and 6 on the effort scale. They rate other people in their household about a half point lower than that. And then the average Irish person lower again, kind of, a full point lower in the scale than themselves. And while, of course, for any given individual, it might be true that they themselves are making more effort than the average Irish person, taking the average across, a representative sample of the Irish population, these two lines should be the same. It doesn't make sense that everyone can't be better than everyone else. So there does seem to be, an important psychological factor at play here, where people are underestimating what others are doing, and that in turn might impact on their own behavior. And I've put a note there at the bottom to say we see the exact same pattern when we ask people how much of an effort they're making to use sustainable transport or shift their electricity use away from peak times. So that was kind of, 6 of the high level, important findings that we've got from our work so far. As you can imagine, there is a lot more we can do with this data. So I'm just going to, briefly talk through some of the ongoing work that we have and some of the outputs that we're planning. So first of all, in terms of outputs, we've kind of got, a multi-pronged approach to this. So on the one hand, we are producing summary reports, kind of giving fairly high level findings like the ones I've just shown you. So we have published one report already back in December, which covers, the previous winters, the heating season or previous winter. So the first, I think, was 5 waves. Then we're in the process of preparing a second report, which will cover the summer season. We're also planning at some point this year to, get the data from the first year of BETT out and make it publicly available so that it can be used by other researchers. I can't commit to a strict timeline on that yet, but it is on our list for this year. And then the other thing we're doing then is kind of doing deeper dives on specific topics. So for example, peak electricity use, travel behavior, energy poverty, and heating behavior are some of the topics we've identified to do more research on, and indeed we're already doing in some areas. So for example, under peak electricity use, this is just to give you a flavor of what we can do with the BETT data. So you'll remember, I said for different electrical appliances, we asked people various follow-up questions about how they used it. One of the questions we asked them is what time of day they use the appliance. And from this, we can kind of start seeing, for different appliances, which are more or less likely to be used at peak times. And this already has been very informative to us. So in Ireland, just in the last year or two, there's been kind of much more of a drive to get people to shift their electricity use away from peak times. And there's been some ad campaigns run. And if you look at these ad campaigns, they're typically, people waiting to put on their washing machine, for example, or their dishwasher. But you can see from the data we've gathered here that actually it's a fairly small proportion of, people using the washing machine that are using it at peak time. So it's actually not a huge contributor necessarily, whereas everyone obviously is cooking at peak times or heating water, so they might be more relevant behaviors to target. And Kieran, who's also on the call, he's doing a more detailed analysis now, trying to attribute kilowatt hours to different activities and see what activities are using up the most kilowatt hours at peak times, and therefore should potentially be the target of interventions. And you can see there really just how huge the contribution is of cooking behavior as opposed to anything else. And washing machine, for example, is down there at just 3%. Now, this is work in progress. This isn't a final result, but hopefully this shows you how kind of informative our data can be. Another area where we're hoping to do quite a lot more is in energy poverty. So through BETT, as I mentioned earlier, where we ask questions about energy expenditure and income, and from that we can kind of calculate some of typically used objective measures of energy poverty. But we know, of course, that there's drawbacks of using these measures. So we also use subjective measures such as difficulty paying bills or cutting back on heat or other essentials. And I mean, first of all, just being able to track these over the year, I think is quite informative, because a lot of energy poverty studies typically kind of look at it, it's not tracking it over the months. It's a kind of snapshot of how people deal with things in the year in general. But I think it is useful to see how the burden changes across the months. We'll be doing more work to look at, how these measures compare to each other, like what types of people are in one group versus another. And of course, what's really useful about BETT is that we can then relate these measures back to behavior and see what types of inefficient behaviors people in energy poverty might be more or less inclined to engage in. So getting towards the end now, so I'm just going to do a quick summary. So first of all, a recap of our main findings. So first of all, inefficient travel and home energy behaviors are still prevalent year round. So, people tell us they're making an effort, and I'm sure they probably are, but there's definitely room for improvement. There's definitely areas where there's still potential for energy saving. Secondly, and very importantly, different types of people are engaging in different inefficient behaviors. And related to this as well, sociodemographic factors are typically more influential than psychological factors. And I think this is, really important, because to me it shows that it's as much about who people are in terms of the structures that surround them and the lifestyles that they live, and that is more important than say how motivated they are to save energy. And it points for a need for supports, structural supports, as well as just trying to motivate people to save energy. And it's also very interesting because if you remember at the start, I was saying this survey was inspired by a similar one we ran during COVID, looking at people's risk taking and social activity during COVID. And there it was kind of the opposite finding. We found that actually sociodemographic factors weren't that predictive of whether people were engaging in risky behavior. What really mattered was the psychological factors. And here we find the complete opposite. And I think that's an interesting and important difference. The fourth finding then is that self-reported understanding was the most influential psychological factor that we measured, and that really points to the need for more education and to really give people practical tips on how to save energy, not just trying to motivate them in an abstract way. And the fifth then was that worry about climate had a stronger relationship with efficiency than worry about cost of living, but saving money is the top ranked self-reported motivation for saving energy. So it's a tricky one to kind of, I'd be interested in hearing anyone's thoughts on that one, but I guess it's just more a word of caution to, don't always rely on people's self-reported motivations. There might be other things at play that they themselves aren't aware of. And then the last finding I highlighted is that the effort others are making matters, but that this is systematically underestimated, and this is maybe something that should be addressed. So that's kind of a recap of the findings, but just to finish off, I'll just give you 3 key takeaways from the webinar today. So first of all, it's that behavioral science can help us improve how we measure behavior as well as how we try to change it. So we often think of behavioral science as being a tool for designing interventions to change behavior, which it is, but it can also be useful in measuring it more accurately in the first place and choosing what behaviors we actually should be targeting. And the day reconstruction method is an invaluable tool for gathering granular and accurate data on energy behaviors. The second key takeaway then is that communications should take a bespoke approach depending on the specific behavior targeted. So I showed you, different types of people are engaging in different behaviors. So depending on the behavior you want to target, you might need to target different people. But in any case, there's a need for education, practical advice, but that needs to be combined with system change and structural supports to generally change how people need to use energy in their day-to-day lives. And then the third key takeaway I have is that communications need to highlight the effort that others are making. So to close that gap in perception between what people think others are doing and what they actually are doing, and to foster collective action. So thanks very much for listening. Thanks to Sam for inviting me, and thanks to my team who are here, and especially Kieran and Lucy on the call, who've put a lot of work into BETT. And I'll pass back to Sam.